Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know how much we love getting your requests, and this one, well, it's a doozy.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
We're diving into a whole biology chapter today, like the whole thing, evolution, the big ideas in biology, the works. Basically, you want the super condensed version, right? All the key points and how it relates to, real life.
Exactly.
So get ready. We'll be figuring out how something as small as a beach mouse can help us understand these huge concepts in biology.
Right.
And we'll take a look at DNA, which is like the language of life, but with a four-letter alphabet.
Exactly like a four-letter alphabet.
Kind of crazy. And we'll even get into the whole how science, technology, and society all kind of like intertwine.
It's all connected.
It is. All right, so to start this deep dive off, you know me, I love a good framework.
Right.
So let's set the stage. What are the big, foundational ideas in this chapter?
Well, the chapter kicks off with the 5 central themes of biology. They're kind of like the pillars of everything.
Okay, I'm all about pillars. Give me those 5 themes. What are we talking about?
So we've got organization, information, energy and matter, interactions, and then, of course, evolution.
5 themes to, unlock the secrets of life. That's ambitious. All right, let's start with organization. What does the chapter tell us about that?
It all starts with this idea of biological organization, which moves from the broadest level, the biosphere, down to the most basic building blocks like molecules and atoms. The chapter actually has this great analogy of zooming in, from space all the way down to like a single leaf.
I can picture it, yeah. It's like one of those videos that shows the scale of the universe.
Well,
You start with galaxies and then zoom into planets and then all the way to a blade of grass.
Exactly. And what's so cool is that each level of this organization, you get new properties emerging, things that weren't there before. Like think about a chloroplast, in a plant cell.
Right.
It has chlorophyll, but it can't do photosynthesis on its own.
Right. It needs the whole system of itself to, work together.
Yeah. Exactly. And this is where scientists use a reductionist approach, where they break things down into their smaller parts to try and understand them. But they've also come to understand systems biology, which is about how all those parts interact.
So it's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but it doesn't tell you how to bake it.
Mm-hmm.
You need the recipe, you need the oven temperature, you need the whole system.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of systems, this is where our little beach mouse comes in.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of how structure and function are related, which is super important for survival,
Okay, hold on. What does a beach mouse have to do with all of this?
Well, picture this. Beach mice living on these white sand dunes have really light dappled fur, right? It helps them blend in.
Right, camouflage.
Exactly. But inland, the same species of mouse has darker fur to match the soil and the plants. It's all about not becoming a hawk's lunch.
Oh, that's amazing. Like natural selection at work.
Right. Which actually brings us to the second theme, information. The chapter dives into how DNA is basically this molecule of inheritance. It carries all the instructions to build and maintain an organism.
Okay, so DNA, it's like the blueprint of life. I always pictured it as this crazy complex molecule, which I guess it is, but how does it actually hold all that information?
Think of DNA as a twisted ladder, the famous double helix.
Right.
Each rung of this ladder is made up of 2 of these chemical building blocks called nucleotides. And here's the thing, there are only 4 types of these nucleotides.
So all the complexity of life is coded in just 4 letters. That's wild.
It is, right. And these sequences are organized into genes, which are like specific instructions for making things cells need, usually proteins.
So genes are like individual recipes in a cookbook, and DNA is like the whole cookbook.
I like that analogy. And then the process of going from that information in the gene to actually building a protein is called gene expression. It involves 2 main steps: transcription, where the DNA is copied into RNA, and then translation, where the RNA is used to assemble a chain of amino acids, which are like the building blocks of proteins.
So it's like this whole molecular factory going on inside us.
It really is. And here's what's even more remarkable. This whole process is basically the same in all life forms, from bacteria to humans. It's more evidence that everything is connected.
It is wild to think we have something so fundamental in common with bacteria.
Right. And it's a good segue to this idea of genomics, the study of whole sets of genes.
So instead of looking at one gene, genomics is like looking at the entire genetic landscape.
Exactly. And technology now lets scientists sequence entire genomes super fast. It's like having this detailed map of an organism's entire genetic blueprint.
I can only imagine what that means for things like medicine. What are some of the real-world applications of this?
Oh, tons. It's having a huge impact on fields like medicine and agriculture. For instance, in medicine, genomics is being used to develop more personalized treatments based on a person's unique genetic makeup.
So like tailored healthcare.
Yeah, we can identify genetic predispositions to certain diseases, which allows for earlier intervention and prevention. And in agriculture, genomics is being used to develop crops that are more resistant to pests and diseases, or that can thrive in tough environments.
It's amazing to think that we can use this knowledge to like improve health, food security, and so much more. Okay, so we've talked organization and information. What's next on the list of those big themes?
The next theme is energy and matter, which gets into how life is all about, well, the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. And it all starts with the sun.
Ah, the sun, the ultimate energy source. So plants use sunlight for photosynthesis. I remember that much.
Yes, but the sun is the energy source for almost all ecosystems on Earth. So plants, algae, and some bacteria, they capture that light energy and turn it into chemical energy in the form of sugars and other molecules. That's photosynthesis.
Well, like nature's solar panels.
Right. And that chemical energy then gets passed on to other organisms when they eat those plants or algae. And eventually it goes to decomposers when organisms die and break down.
It's like this cascade of energy, all starting with the sun.
It is. But there's a key difference in how energy and matter move through an ecosystem. So energy flows one way, it enters as sunlight, and then eventually exits as heat. But matter cycles. All the chemicals that make up, an organism, they eventually return to the soil, the air, and water, and then plants take them up again, and the cycle starts all over.
It's like this intricate dance with energy flowing and matter cycling through.
It is. And speaking of interactions, that's actually our fourth theme. This one highlights how dynamic life really is. At every level, from molecules to ecosystems, interactions are what make sure everything works together.
It's not just about the individual parts, but about how they communicate and work together.
Right. And a prime example is feedback regulation. It's where a biological process basically regulates itself. The most common one is negative feedback, where the output of a process kind of like puts the brakes on the initial stimulus. Think of a thermostat. As the temperature in your house goes up, the thermostat kicks on to cool things down. When it hits the right temperature, it shuts off.
I get the thermostat, but how does that work in like a living organism?
Well, think about blood sugar control. When you eat, your blood glucose level goes up, right? So this triggers your pancreas to release insulin. And insulin helps your cells take up that glucose from your blood, which lowers your blood sugar levels. Then as your blood sugar drops, you don't need as much insulin, so that signal to release insulin decreases. It shuts off the process, keeps everything balanced.
So it's all about keeping things in check.
Exactly. But then there's positive feedback, where the output of a process actually amplifies the initial stimulus. This is what leads to really rapid changes. Think about when you get a cut. The first platelets that arrive release chemicals that attract even more platelets, and that creates a cascade that forms a blood clot.
So positive feedback ramps things up quickly, and negative feedback keeps things balanced.
You got it. And these interactions aren't just happening inside organisms. Organisms are constantly interacting with each other and their environment. Take the acacia tree in the African savanna, for example. It interacts with microorganisms in the soil that help it get nutrients. Insects pollinate its flowers, giraffes eat its leaves, and then lions might even prey on those giraffes. It's all connected.
It is. It's like this whole web of connections with everything influencing everything else.
Exactly. And sometimes those interactions are mutually beneficial, like, the acacia tree and its pollinators, and sometimes they involve one organism benefiting at the expense of another, like a lion and a zebra.
And of course, there's the interaction between organisms and the environment. The chapter talks about climate change as a huge example.
It is a big one. The effects of climate change, things like rising temperatures and changes in rainfall, are impacting organisms and ecosystems everywhere.
It sounds like we need to move beyond just studying individual species and really look at this bigger picture,
Yeah.
how everything is connected. Okay, we've covered 4 themes: organization, information, energy, and matter, and interactions. What's that final theme that ties everything together?
The fifth, and I'd argue most important theme, is evolution. It's the very process that has shaped the incredible diversity of life we see today.
Evolution, the grand unifying theory of biology.
You said it, and that's what we're going to dive into next.
I'm ready for it. Let's unlock the secrets of evolution. Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
All right, so evolution. We're ready to tackle this one. It's this core theme that helps us understand how life on Earth is both unified and incredibly diverse at the same time.
I'm all ears. But evolution, it can feel kind of abstract,
Yeah.
where do we even start to grasp something that big?
Well, a good place to start is with how biologists organize all the variety of life out there. All life right now is grouped into these three major categories called domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya.
Okay, 3 domains. What makes each one unique? I vaguely remember this from way back, but a refresher would be great.
Sure. So bacteria and archaea both consist of these single-celled organisms called prokaryotes. They're pretty simple cells, they don't have a nucleus to store their DNA, and they don't have these other specialized structures inside them.
So prokaryotes are like the older, simpler versions of life on Earth.
You got it. They've been around for billions of years, and they're super diverse and abundant. Like, they're everywhere. In the soil, water, the air, even inside our bodies.
Wow. Sharing my body with these ancient life forms, that's kind of crazy.
Wow.
What about eukarya? That's where humans fit in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Eukarya includes all organisms with eukaryotic cells, which are much bigger and more complex than prokaryotes. They've got that nucleus to hold their DNA and other specialized structures called organelles.
So eukarya, that's everything from plants and animals to fungi and protists.
Hey, you nailed it. And protists, they're a fascinating bunch, so diverse in their forms and lifestyles. Some are plant-like, some are animal-like, some are even fungus-like. They're like the misfits of the eukaryotic world, and scientists are still figuring out how to best classify them based on their evolutionary history.
The misfits, I like that. But even with all this crazy variety out there, the chapter talks about how there's this amazing unity among all life forms, too. How does that work?
That's the beauty of evolution. It explains both the unity and the diversity. Despite all the differences, there are these striking similarities at every level, from the molecular structure of DNA to the basic building blocks of cells.
So how do we explain that paradox?
Yeah.
Being so different but so fundamentally the same.
Well, Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory, he proposed that the unity of life stems from what he called descent with modification.
Descent with modification. Sounds complicated.
It's a pretty simple idea, actually. It means that all living species are descended from a common ancestor, but over time they've accumulated these differences, these modifications, as they adapted to different environments.
So it's like this giant family tree, right, with branches stretching back billions of years. We're all part of that tree, connected to some ancient ancestor.
That's the idea. And all the diversity we see is a result of countless branches splitting off from that ancient trunk, each evolving and adapting to unique circumstances.
That's a pretty awe-inspiring image when you think about it. But how does that descent with modification actually happen? What drives it?
Darwin's big breakthrough was figuring out this mechanism called natural selection. And it boils down to three key observations about the world.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with those observations.
First, individuals within a population aren't all identical. They vary in their traits, and a lot of those traits are heritable, meaning they can be passed down from parents to offspring. It's why you might have your mom's eyes and your dad's hair.
Right, we inherit traits from our parents. What's the second observation?
Second, populations can make more offspring than the environment can actually support. There are always more individuals born than can survive and reproduce.
So there's this competition for resources. Food, water, space, all the things organisms need to survive.
Precisely. And here's the third observation. Those individuals with traits that give them an advantage in their specific environment are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those advantageous traits onto their offspring.
Ah, so it's all about being well-suited to your surroundings, having traits that give you an edge. Is this where the survival of the fittest thing comes in?
Yeah, but fitness in this sense doesn't necessarily mean being the strongest or the fastest. It's about having traits that help you survive and reproduce in your specific environment.
Okay, that makes sense. So over many generations, this natural selection thing can actually lead to some pretty big changes in a population.
Right.
Those changes could eventually lead to the formation of new species.
Exactly. The chapter actually uses the example of Darwin's finches to illustrate how descent with modification works in the real world.
Oh yeah, Darwin's finches, those are the birds with all the different beak shapes on the Galapagos Islands, right? I remember learning about them.
Those are the ones. Darwin collected these finches while he was on his voyage, and later he realized they were all descended from a common ancestor that had probably come from mainland South America.
So over time, different groups of these finches ended up on different islands with different food sources. And natural selection would have favored the birds with the beaks best suited for eating what was available on their island.
You got it. So finches with beaks that were good at cracking seeds thrived on islands with lots of seeds, while the ones with beaks good for probing flowers for nectar, They did well on islands with lots of flowering plants. And over many generations, those differences in beak shape, they became more and more pronounced. And eventually, boom, new species, each adapted to their specific environment.
It's amazing how a process that seems so simple,
Yeah.
variations, competition, and the best traits winning out, can lead to such incredible diversity.
It is a powerful concept. And while natural selection is the main driver behind adaptation, it's not the only mechanism of evolution. You also have random genetic changes and the movement of genes between populations, which can also contribute to the evolutionary process.
So evolution is this constant process shaped by multiple forces always pushing change in life on Earth.
Exactly. And understanding evolution is crucial for so much. It helps us understand how all living things are interconnected, how life has changed over billions of years, and even how to address modern-day challenges like antibiotic resistance and climate change.
Evolution really is the key to understanding so much about the world around us. It's fascinating, but kind of daunting too. Okay, the chapter also gets into the whole process of scientific inquiry, right? Like how scientists actually go about investigating and learning about the world.
Yes. It explores how scientists go about figuring out how species are related and how they've changed over time.
I remember learning about the scientific method back in the day. Make observations, form a hypothesis, test it with experiments, and then draw conclusions. Is that basically it?
That's a good summary, but it's not always so linear in practice. Scientific inquiry is much more dynamic and less predictable. There's a lot of backtracking and revisions, and, sometimes you stumble upon unexpected discoveries.
So it's less like following a straight recipe and more like exploring a winding path.
Exactly. And the core of it is this process of forming and testing hypotheses.
Can you remind me what exactly a hypothesis is? It's been a minute since biology class.
A hypothesis is basically a tentative explanation for something you've observed, like a phenomenon or a scientific problem. It's an educated guess based on what you already know and what you've seen, but it has to be testable. A good hypothesis leads to predictions that you can then investigate through experiments or more observations.
So you're proposing a solution to a puzzle and then using experiments to see if the pieces fit.
I love that analogy. The chapter uses this study on mouse coat coloration to show how scientists form and test their hypotheses. Remember those beach mice and inland mice with the different colored fur for camouflage?
Oh, yeah. That was a great example of adaptation.
Well, scientists wanted to test this hypothesis that the different coat colors were adaptations that camouflaged the mice and protected them from predators. They didn't want to just assume that was the case.
So how did they test that? Did they, put mice out in the open and just watch?
Well, that wouldn't be very ethical, would it?
True.
So instead, they used these clay models of mice. Some painted to look like the beach mice, and some to look like the inland mice. Then they put equal numbers of these models in both the beach and inland habitats and left them out overnight.
So the models were like stand-ins for real mice, and they wanted to see if the color of the model affected how often it got attacked.
Exactly. The next morning, they checked all the models for signs of predation, like bite marks, missing pieces, anything that showed a predator had tried to get them.
That's clever. What did they find?
The results were super clear. The models that blended in with their surroundings, they were attacked way less often than the ones that stood out.
The camouflage worked. The ones that matched had a survival advantage.
Exactly. This really supported their hypothesis that coat coloration provides camouflage and protects mice from becoming dinner.
It's like a real-life detective story. Scientists using clues and evidence to solve mysteries in nature.
I love that. And this study shows a couple of key things about how scientists design experiments. So first, they had a control group, which were the models that blended in with their environment. This gave them a baseline to compare to, how often are models attacked when they have good camouflage. Then they compared that to the experimental group, the models that didn't blend in.
So the control group helps isolate the effect they're studying. In this case, how camouflage affects predation.
Exactly. And another important thing is manipulating only one variable at a time. In this study, the only difference between the control group and the experimental group was the color of the models. Everything else, location, time of year, number of predators in the area, all of that was kept as consistent as possible.
Got it. So that way they know any difference in attack rates was due to the color and not some other factor.
Exactly. By carefully designing the experiment, they could draw solid conclusions about the role of camouflage.
This makes me wonder, do scientists always have to do experiments to test their hypotheses? What if you can't do an experiment for whatever reason?
That's a great question. Experiments aren't always possible or ethical. Like, imagine trying to test the effects of smoking on human health by, forcing people to smoke. You can't do that.
No, definitely not.
So in those cases, they rely on observational studies where they collect data without actually manipulating any variables. For instance, they might observe and compare the long-term health of people who choose to smoke versus those who don't. It's like watching a natural experiment unfold.
Studying something in the real world without interfering.
Exactly. Observational studies can't prove cause and effect with the same certainty as a controlled experiment, but they can still offer some really valuable insights, especially for these complex things where an experiment isn't possible.
It's so cool how scientists use all these different methods to understand the world. It's like they're detectives using every tool they have.
I like that analogy. And it's important to remember that science is rarely a solo thing. The chapter talks about how it's a collaborative field where scientists are always building on each other's work and sharing their findings.
It's a team effort, not just these brilliant minds working in isolation.
Right. Scientists often collaborate across different disciplines, bringing different expertise to the table to tackle these complex problems. They're sharing ideas and data and methods. It's all about working together to advance our understanding.
That makes so much sense. Nobody can be an expert in everything. So another point the chapter brings up is that science and technology are intertwined, but they aren't the same thing. Can you break that down a little bit?
Of course. Think of it this way. Science is all about understanding the natural world. Technology is about applying that knowledge to solve problems or create new things. Science is discovery, technology is invention.
So science lays the foundation, and technology builds on that foundation to create tools and solutions.
That's a great way to put it. And oftentimes, technology even provides new tools that help advance scientific research. Like the invention of the microscope, it totally revolutionized how we understand cells and microorganisms.
It's like a feedback loop, where science inspires technology, which fuels even more scientific discoveries. It's amazing how connected it all is.
It really is. And this brings up a really important point, the importance of diverse perspectives in science. We need scientists from all walks of life, with different backgrounds and experiences and ways of thinking.
So it's not just about having biologists and chemists and physicists, but also about having people from different cultures and genders and socioeconomic backgrounds all contributing to the scientific conversation.
Exactly. A diverse scientific community brings a wider range of viewpoints and approaches and values to the table. It's essential for pushing scientific progress, for ensuring that the research is ethical, and that the benefits of science are shared by everyone.
That's a powerful idea. Diversity makes science stronger and more relevant to the world we live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that actually leads perfectly into the next part of our deep dive, the profound implications of understanding evolution for our place in the grand scheme of life.
That sounds like some deep thinking. I'm ready to dive in. Okay, so we've covered so much ground already, from those big five themes of biology to like the nitty-gritty of how scientists do their thing, but I'm ready for those profound implications. You mentioned, how does understanding evolution change the way we see ourselves and our place in the world?
Well, you know that concept of descent with modification, how all life is connected through this huge family tree stretching back billions of years.
It is mind-blowing to think we share an ancestor with everything from a redwood to a mushroom to bacteria. It really makes you feel connected to it all.
It does, and that realization, it's totally revolutionized how we think about biology and our place in nature. We're not separate from the natural world. We're part of it. We're a product of the same evolutionary forces that have shaped every other organism on Earth.
We're not just looking at nature from the outside. We're active participants in this ongoing story of evolution.
Exactly. And with that understanding comes some pretty big ethical considerations. If we recognize that every species has its own unique evolutionary journey, its own story, it suggests we have a responsibility to protect biodiversity, to safeguard this web of life that keeps us all going.
It makes you realize that extinction isn't just about losing one species. It's like losing a whole branch on the tree of life, a unique and irreplaceable history.
That's a great way to put it. And the amazing thing is that those stories are written in the language of DNA passed down from one generation to the next. So by comparing the DNA sequences of different species, we can trace their evolutionary relationships, reconstruct that tree of life, and really start to understand the processes that created all this diversity.
It's like we have this molecular record of life's history, and we're just starting to figure out how to read it.
It's a fantastic analogy, and understanding evolution isn't just about the past. It has really practical applications today, like helping us come up with new strategies to fight infectious diseases.
Right. How does evolution tie into fighting diseases?
Well, by understanding how pathogens like bacteria and viruses evolve, we can develop more effective vaccines and treatments, for example, knowing that influenza viruses are always evolving, helps us predict which strains are likely to be going around each year so we can make a better flu vaccine.
So we're trying to stay one step ahead of evolution.
You got it. We're using our knowledge of these evolutionary processes to guide our actions and make smarter decisions in healthcare and beyond.
It's a great example of how science can help us solve real-world problems when we think about things from an evolutionary perspective.
Absolutely. And it also comes back to that important point we made before about the need for diverse perspectives in science to solve these complex challenges. We need scientists from all different backgrounds with all different ways of thinking.
Because the more diverse our scientific community is, the more creative and innovative our solutions will be.
Exactly. And that diversity of thought makes it more likely that we'll find discoveries that benefit everyone and the planet.
So well said. After this incredible deep dive, what would you say is the main takeaway for our listener?
I think the key takeaway is that biology, it's an incredibly dynamic and constantly evolving field of study, from the intricate workings of a single cell to the vastness of evolutionary history. There's always more to discover and explore, and by understanding those 5 core themes, organization, information, energy, and matter interactions and evolution, we can really start to appreciate the interconnectedness and wonder of life.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights how we're all part of this incredible journey of life, constantly changing, adapting, and yet united by our shared ancestry and our dependence on this intricate web of life.
That's it exactly. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, if you're left with more questions than answers, well, that's fantastic. That's what science is all about. Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring. Keep pushing the boundaries of what we know.
And who knows, maybe you, dear listener, will be the one to make the next big discovery in biology.
The possibilities are endless. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been an amazing journey. Until next time, stay curious.